Hi, I'm Helen Bauer, and this is the Heart of Hospice podcast. The Heart of Hospice podcast is your source for compassionate and informative discussions about hospice and end-of-life care. I'm a certified hospice and palliative care nurse with over 15 years of experience. Whether you're a caregiver, someone with a serious illness, or you simply need to know more about hospice care, this podcast is for you. Join me as we explore all the aspects of hospice, from the details of caregiving to the emotional and spiritual dimensions of end-of-life journeys. For more resources and to connect with me, visit theheartofhospice.com and find us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Keep listening for today's episode.
This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time. Content presented in the following podcast is for information purposes only. Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the host and guest and may not represent the views and opinions of the Whole Care Network. Always consult with your physician for any medical advice, and always consult with your attorney for any legal advice. And thank you for listening to the Whole Care Network.
This episode of the Heart of Hospice podcast is being sponsored by bkbooks.com. Barbara Carnes and her team at BK Books have created the Approaching Death Support Kit to help educate and support families with clarity and compassion. This new bundle is a practical, ready-to-use resource for the bedside and includes many of Barbara's most trusted booklets. For more information, visit bkbooks.com or see the show notes for the link to bkbooks.com.
In this episode, Beth Cavenaugh and I are getting back to the basics of hospice, talking about live discharges from hospice care. My guest co-host today is Beth Cavenaugh. She's a certified hospice and palliative care nurse with a rich experience in caring for patients at the end of life. Beth's mission is for everyone to exit this world knowing their wishes will be respected and they will get comfort and quality care in the final stages of their lives. Beth Cavenaugh and I are talking about live discharges from hospice today. What to expect, what's supposed to happen, and how to be an advocate to make sure that transition process from hospice to another care team goes smoothly. We're going to be talking about a lot of the details, what you can expect from the different team members, and discharge planning, which is super important when it comes to going off of hospice care, and how you can appeal if the patient or caregiver don't agree with the hospice agency's decision to discharge. So this one's chock full of information. You're going to want to listen to the details. Here's my conversation with Beth Cavenaugh about live discharges from hospice care. We're back today with our Back to the Hospice Basics episode, and my friend and colleague Beth Cavenaugh is with me. Hi, Beth.
Hey, Helen. It's good to be back. Thanks for having me.
I'm so glad to talk with you again. You're such a good sounding board for me. When I don't remember something, you remember it, so it works out perfectly.
Well, vice versa. I mean, I really appreciate your global and in-depth perspective of all things hospice. So
thank you. Well, we are talking about a big event in the life and care of a hospice patient, and that is a discharge from hospice care. A live discharge, when the patient no longer qualifies for hospice care. It's a big deal. It is a big deal.
Yeah, and a lot of times I call it graduation, which some people really love, and I've had a lot of patients that are very excited about not being a hospice patient anymore.
Right. It sounds great.
It does. It sounds great. And then there's the reality of taking away some services that may have been put in place. So,
Right. And a lot of times, these hospice patients have been on service with hospice teams for quite a while. So it's a big healthcare culture shift to remove that team and set them up with a new care system.
right, because I think of somebody who has dementia maybe, and they've come onto hospice after perhaps an event they had. They went to the hospital, their baseline was lower. They weren't doing very well, maybe mentally off, physically weaker, more fatigued. They come onto hospice, they have their caregiver, really tending to them. They have a CNA coming in, they have a nurse coming in, and having that support system really helps them do so much better. I mean, maybe they're getting their food, more often. Maybe they're getting medicated better for their pain or their agitation, and really doing a lot better. But so much better that because they're not declining, they don't actually meet criteria for hospice anymore. And there are very strict Medicare guidelines for who meets criteria for hospice.
Right. I've seen that happen quite a bit with respiratory patients, people with COPD and emphysema. Yeah, they
Yes.
have these terrible exacerbations and they're in the hospital, their status is lousy, and then they come home. The hospice team is supporting the caregiver. The meds get consistent. The caregiver feels comfortable. The meds are customized. And lo and behold, the patient begins to improve.
Right. Right.
And so it does happen, even with hospice patients. So we're going to talk about what that looks like when a discharge is going to happen, what we call a live discharge for extended prognosis, which means the patient is not expected to die within 6 months, which is the hospice criteria. So most states have a requirement that a patient or the decision maker has to receive a discharge notice within a certain number of days prior to the discharge. In the state where I work in Texas, it's a 5-day discharge notice. You have to let people know no less than 5 days in advance. So in other words, if you're a caregiver or a patient, your hospice nurse should never walk into your home and say, oh, by the way, we're going to discharge you tomorrow.
Right. You need a heads up so you can get some things into place.
Right. And there's some things that the hospice team is supposed to be doing for you before they actually discharge you off hospice care. They're not just going to hand you a piece of paper and say goodbye. There's some planning that's supposed to happen when a discharge is going to happen.
Right.
So let's talk about that discharge planning from the perspective of the nurse. I'm going to let you take this one because I know that's your area of expertise. What kind of discharge planning and plans would you expect the nurse to be doing when a patient's going to be discharged off?
Well, I think of their provider, I think of their equipment, I think of their medications, and I think of maybe caregiving services that they've had. So we kind of look at these layers of support that have been provided through hospice and make sure that it's a seamless transition when they're discharged from hospice. And so making sure that they have a provider, a physician that can oversee their care. And generally they'll go back to their physician they were with prior to hospice, unless they stayed with their physician the whole entire time. A lot of times, cancer patients or respiratory patients, they'll stay with their provider throughout their hospice journey.
Right.
So they'll make sure they have a provider, make sure that their medications are going to be able to be covered by, when they're not on a hospice, because the hospice benefit does pay for any medications that have to do with pain or symptom management or their hospice diagnosis. And so coordinating that with their new provider and, really looking at the kind of care they've been receiving in the home. So if the CNAs had to go out to their home, maybe 2 times a week, maybe looking into some home health options, kind of coordinating with the social worker to see if they can gather more resources in the community. to help them, just kind of still have a bountiful quality of life, even though they're not with hospice support. And the company from the hospice company will come and remove the equipment, and then the community service provider will drop off equipment. So that might be a bed or oxygen tanks, things like that you've been needing and that have been helpful in the home.
Right. And it's supposed to be an overlapping transition. When the hospice equipment gets picked up and that oxygen gets taken out, there should be oxygen coming in. Hospice shouldn't immediately just decide, we're going to take your oxygen out of your home and not leave you with any sort of support at all. It's not supposed to work that way. Definitely not. So let's talk about the psychosocial planning. I'll field that one. So the social worker should be looking at the caregiving system. What changes need to happen? So if they've had an aide coming in, is it possible to get the patient estate paid provider, an aide that would come in and provide some hours, or coordinating with the nurse, like you're saying, to let the home health know if the patient qualifies for home health, that the home health aide would be needed to provide some personal care as well. They look at meals and financial resources, and of course to make sure that the safety equipment in the house is still there. All of that. So between the nurse and the social worker, that's what makes up discharge planning. Mm-hmm. And that is a regulatory thing. Discharge planning is required by regulation. But a lot of agencies aren't great at doing the psychosocial part. In my experience, we catch the medicines, right? We make sure the medicines are filled until the patient establishes with a new doctor. We make sure there's oxygen out there. And then the rest of it's kind of left to blow in the wind.
Right.
But the social worker is responsible for that psychosocial planning to make sure that the discharge is well-rounded when it comes to having a plan.
Right. And I know that families often have a hard time with their loved one being discharged from hospice because they don't have the support they need, like the 24/7 access to a hospice nurse. But that will all be discussed in terms of how to continue to manage their loved one, even though they're not on hospice. So, which will be going back to kind of the usual, which will be calling the provider when needed for any kind of pain or symptom management issues.
Right. Or utilizing the home health, same way,
Right.
having a nurse available. I've seen circumstances where, say, a patient has a catheter. Mm-hmm. And so there's a need there that has to be met by a nurse. So you want the caregiver, the patient wants to make sure that those questions are asked. Who is going to be taking care of that? Who will manage that going forward if the hospice doesn't manage that for us? I think there's some advocacy that has to happen to make sure nothing slips through the cracks.
Right. And, for most families, always ask questions. If you're feeling like getting left in limbo, ask them really good, specific follow-up questions. Grandma's got a catheter. What's going to happen with that?
Grandma has a wound.
Right. What's going to happen with that? What about her morphine? Are we still going to be able to get it? How much can we give her still? So ask really specific questions about your loved one's care so that the coordination can be smooth and ideally seamless.
Right. The whole idea is it's supposed to be a transition, not a drop out of hospice with a kick to another silo of healthcare. And sometimes it does happen that way. We're not always great at communicating. Right. So most medical mistakes are made, like 86% of medical mistakes are made during transitions in care. And going from hospice to home health is one of those transitions. That's why we're talking about it today. So, Beth, let's talk about the situation that occurs when a patient or caregiver doesn't agree with the discharge off of hospice care. If they don't think that they should be discharged, that they still qualify, they still meet the criteria, and they don't agree with the decision that the hospice agency has made.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know much about it, Helen. I know they can appeal, and I think that you can probably speak um, to this question.
I can. I can. So there is an appeal process that, by the way, the hospice agency is supposed to inform the patient and caregiver of when they give them the discharge notice. They're supposed to say, hey, we don't think you qualify for hospice anymore for whatever reasons. We're giving you notice of this now. And here is where you can appeal this process. It's a long set of initials. I couldn't even tell you all of them right now off the top of my head. QIO is how it's commonly known. And there is an appeals process. I think the most important thing for a hospice patient and decision maker to know is that when you file an appeal, while it's being processed, your hospice care has to continue. The hospice agency is still responsible for providing care while your appeal is being considered.
Who actually considers? Is it Medicare?
Well, it's the QIO on behalf of Medicare.
Oh, okay.
On behalf of Medicare. And what they do is they look at the medical record, at what's being documented, what the patient's status is, what they're, weighing it against the hospice criteria. And then the decision is made to uphold the decision to discharge. So, yes, the hospice agency can discharge, or no, we think the hospice patient is still appropriate, so you cannot discharge and care must continue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. My guess is a lot of the information regarding the decline or the plateau or the improvement of the patient will come from the patient and or the caregiver. Is that right? Or do they just go off the hospice record?
They go off the hospice record. So they're looking at the electronic medical record, or what we call an EMR or an EHR. They're looking at that documentation.
Okay, to make sure that the patient has, look at their weight, see what's happening with that, look at their kind of fatigue, energy level, look at how much they're eating, that type of thing.
Are they symptomatic according to their terminal diagnosis? There are a lot of things to consider, but the hospice is responsible for making sure all of that gets entered into the medical record. So that's what the QIO review is looking at.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's complicated, and I don't know that the general public, most people who go into hospice don't realize that they can file an appeal when their person or they themselves are going to be discharged. Mm-hmm. It's a big decision to push back on that, I think.
Right. It is a big decision, but if you feel, I mean, I've been in hospice for about 18 years, and I've only kind of heard some social workers talking about it maybe 5 to 10 times where it's actually been appealed. So I know that it doesn't happen that frequently, mostly because I think hospices, we like to keep patients on because we know it's beneficial to them, but we also can't be Medicare fraudulent. So
right.
If a patient is not declining and is plateaued or is improving, we simply, it's not legal to keep them on our hospice program. But I do know that it's appeals in general, at least in my experience, have feel infrequent.
I think so. I think one of the reasons that it happens infrequently is because a caregiver's responsible for doing that, and they have limited energy, limited time, limited resources, limited attention span. And here they are going to fight this and push against this when they really don't have the bandwidth to do it. It's just another piece of advocacy that takes energy from them.
I know. God bless the caregivers. But I do think if you feel like your patient, you're the one who sees them on the day to day. So, you have this, the providers, the caregivers, have this global perspective of their loved one. They know what they looked like 6 months ago, 3 months ago, and in the last week. They know what they're actually capable of. So if you really feel like your patient, your loved one is still declining, then, if you can advocate for that, I mean, at least you'll still have hospice services while the appeal is in place.
Exactly. It's a lot to ask, but it may turn out that the review rules in your favor. This conversation is so good, but we're going to take a quick break. Hang on for more great content.
The sponsor for this episode is bkbooks.com. When someone you love is dying, the journey can feel overwhelming. What do? What should you expect? How can you help? Barbara Carnes, RN and end-of-life educator and hospice pioneer, created the Approaching Death Support Kit to bring clarity and practical guidance to the bedside.
Hi, this is Helen, host of the Heart of Hospice podcast. As a hospice nurse, educating the family has always been a top priority for me. The Approaching Death Support Kit from BK Books provides families and caregivers with clear, practical guidance to help them navigate the end-of-life journey with confidence and compassion.
The bundle includes many of Barbara's most trusted booklets, Gone From My Sight, By Your Side, The 11th Hour, Pain at End of Life, and her newest title, Always Offer, Never Force. Whether you're a nurse, social worker, chaplain, or end-of-life doula, this kit supports your work. And for family caregivers listening, it offers gentle, trustworthy guidance to help you care for someone at home and feel more prepared for what's ahead. BK Books offers quantity discounts for teams, agencies, and families, so visit bkbooks.com to explore the Approaching Death Support Kit. See the show notes for this episode for a link to bkbooks.com.
Okay, so I want to talk about the impact that these discharges have on people, because it's more than just a removal of services and setting up a whole new care system. I think there's, for lack of a better word, a grief that occurs. Yeah, I mean, chime in here and see if you think this is a good description, but a lot of times we have these patients for months and then we decide to discharge them, but we've formed relationships with them.
And they feel abandoned.
Yeah.
I think that's a big part of it is feeling abandoned, especially after we came in and we kind of, swooped in with all these amazing services and 24/7 phone contact if needed and great symptom management tools and education upon education. And then we have to retract all that. I think it is griefy for the patients and the families. It is.
And you have to look at how hard it is to make the decision to use hospice care anyway.
Right.
Here we are, we made this crushing decision to put mom on hospice, and we went through all of this agonizing and decision making, and we found a place of peace with the decision. And now you're telling me after all these months that you are going to reverse that decision for us and tell me she no longer qualifies.
Right.
That's a lot to ask.
It is.
Yeah. I think sometimes being on hospice is a hard thing.
I know it is. I mean,
just because we have an industry, basically a factory, that processes a human experience, a machine to manage humanity. It doesn't really, it's an apples to orange relationship to me.
Yeah, I do know. I mean, because oftentimes I'll say that I love the work of being a hospice nurse, and sometimes the system is the hardest part of being a hospice nurse, so because we don't want our patients to go off service because we've developed a intimate connection with somebody, and yet there is this big regulatory beast called Medicare that is guiding this whole process and has all the rules that we just simply have to follow. I mean, because that's where the money comes from. So it's the weird reality of the hospice benefit.
Well, and you have to admit, it's a business. A hospice agency is a business, just like any other, whether it's for-profit or nonprofit. So that part of it has to weigh in because we have to pay our people. You have to be able to bill. Yeah. So Beth, in the 18 years that you've been doing this, surely you've had experience with a patient that you needed a discharge. Can you tell me about a personal experience that you've had when it comes to hospice discharge?
Yeah. And I have the ones that come straight to my mind are ones that are joyful experiences, being discharged off of hospice. So, I've had two patients come to mind, and they came into our hospice facility. I was working in an inpatient home. So it was a small 12-bed facility at the time. And this one gal, she came in and she was comatose. I mean, she'd been weaned off a ventilator in the hospital. The family made the decision to sign her on to hospice. She comes to our facility. She's non-responsive. And then the next day, her eyelids flutter open and she's looking around and she goes, "Am I on hospice again?"
No.
And her granddaughter was sitting in the corner of the room and she goes, "Grandma." And she comes rushing to the bed and she goes, "Am I in hospice again?" Because she'd been to our facility before. And the granddaughter was very sheepish. She goes, "Yeah, you are. You were on a ventilator in the hospital." She goes, "You put me on hospice again?" She was so mad at her granddaughter and her, families, right? We make the best decisions we can in the moment, given the information from the doctors and the nurses, your loved one's going to die in the next week, she'll never be able to talk again. And lo and behold, this woman is very, very in the know, very with the program, very cognitively intact.
And mad.
And, we ended up discharging her several days later off of hospice into her home. Hers wasn't the most joyous. It was more, there was a lot of anger involved in that because she was so mad at her family.
She wasn't mad at you. She wasn't mad at the hospice agency, but she's like, "You waited till I went to sleep and you enrolled me in hospice." Oh my gosh.
Right. So, but for her, it was obviously a great thing to do. And she had so much, I think it just kind of fueled her spirit and will to live. Being in a hospice bed, she was like, "Forget it. I'm going to show you guys."
Yeah, I'm going to show you who needs hospice.
And this other gentleman, he was kind of the same. And he was so excited when we wheeled him out on a stretcher into the AMR as he left our facility, and we discharged him from hospice. And he said, "Gosh, I'm going to do the Shanghai tunnels, Beth. I'm going to do the Shanghai tunnels. I've never done them before." And that was his motivation for getting off. And there are these like underground tunnels we have in Portland, Oregon, and he had never done them. And he was so excited about having the opportunity to do it and to have a second chance on life, and he kind of came in the same way, not as debilitated as the first woman, but really, everybody thought he was going to die within weeks, and he didn't. He surprised everybody and signed off hospice, and it was a very joyous occasion. And I think the important thing to know is, sometimes people go home and maybe it's not as smooth of a transition, or maybe they, some other health issues come up and they end up going to the hospital. And, you can sign back onto hospice pretty much at any time. So,
right.
It's not like it's a one and done deal with hospice. You have pretty much countless opportunities to sign on to hospice. But yeah, I had really joyous experiences when people, that's why I call it graduations. A lot of people don't want to die. So most people don't want to die. So they're joyous experiences.
Yeah. Well, that's a nice way to close, talking about live discharges. So thanks for joining me today on this Back to the Basics of Hospice episode, and we'll talk next time.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me, Helen.
Thanks for listening to the Heart of Hospice podcast. Check out our sponsor in the show notes, and please leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. We would appreciate it if you would share this episode with your friends and family and anyone who needs to know more about hospice. Connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, no matter who you are or where you are in your hospice journey, you are the heart of hospice.
This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time.